Dr. Yuna pressed her delicate crystalline fingers against the control panel and watched the readings with growing fear. The asteroid field was moving faster than their calculations had predicted and would reach their peaceful research colony on Kepler 442b in less than 72 hours. Her colleague, Dr. Minho, stood beside her in the observation dome of their main research facility, and both scientists could see the dark specks growing larger against the star field with each passing minute. The Villani had built their research outpost on this world because it offered perfect conditions for their fragile species. The gravity was light enough that their crystal-based bodies could move without strain, and the thin atmosphere allowed them to work without the heavy environmental suits that most other worlds required. Their people had evolved on a moon with barely any atmosphere, and their bodies were more like living gemstones than the carbon-based life forms that dominated most of the galaxy. Yuna turned to face the communication array and began composing their distress message. She knew that other Galactic Union species would find it difficult to help them because most rescue ships were designed for heavier gravity worlds, and their crews could not survive in the low-pressure environment that the Villani needed. The message would have to be very specific about their requirements. The communication system crackled to life as Yuna began the standard distress protocol. She explained that they were a peaceful research colony with 847,000 civilians who needed immediate evacuation assistance. She carefully detailed their physiological needs and stressed that they required specialized environmental support systems because their bodies could not survive in standard atmospheric conditions. Minho checked the power levels on their transmitter and noticed something troubling. The recent solar flare activity had damaged several of their communication relays, and their signal was only broadcasting on a few frequencies. Most of those frequencies were the newer Galactic Union standard channels, but some of the damaged equipment was sending their message on much older emergency bands that had not been used by civilized space for many decades. Neither scientist realized that their carefully crafted message asking for gentle evacuation assistance was being broadcast on frequencies that only reached the Outer Rim territories, where the newer spacefaring species had established their colonies far beyond the comfortable inner worlds of the Galactic Union. Their desperate plea for help was being received by a very different kind of people. Captain Do-hyun was reviewing supply manifests aboard the human colony ship Sejong when his communications officer, Lieutenant Borum, rushed onto the bridge with an urgent expression. The young officer had been monitoring the old emergency frequencies as part of routine protocol. When she picked up the alien distress signal, Captain Do-hyun listened carefully as the universal translator processed the alien message. The species called themselves Villani, and they were facing complete destruction from an asteroid impact. Their world would be uninhabitable in less than 3 days, and they needed someone to evacuate nearly 1 million civilians. The captain immediately called for his senior staff to assemble in the main briefing room. Admiral Kyung arrived first, followed by Chief Engineer Hana and Medical Officer Dr. Taewoo. The 4 humans studied the message details and began planning their response. Admiral Kyung reviewed the fleet roster and confirmed that they had 12 colony ships in their group, along with 37 military escort vessels and hundreds of smaller support craft. Dr. Taewoo calculated that they could easily handle the medical needs of the alien refugees if they converted several cargo bays into temporary medical facilities. Chief Engineer Hana ran the numbers on their transport capacity and confirmed that they could evacuate the entire alien population in a single operation if they used every available shuttle and transport pod. Captain Do-hyun nodded and gave the order to change course immediately toward the Kepler system. What the humans did not understand was that their response represented the largest humanitarian fleet that had ever been assembled in galactic history. The Galactic Union typically sent 1 or 2 ships to handle evacuation operations because most species could not afford to deploy entire fleets for rescue missions. The human colony ships were massive vessels designed to carry hundreds of thousands of people across interstellar distances. Each ship was essentially a mobile city, with its own manufacturing facilities, hydroponics bays, and defensive systems. The military escort vessels were heavily armed destroyers that could fight off pirate attacks and hostile alien encounters. To the humans, this was simply a standard emergency response protocol. When someone sent a distress call, you brought everything you had and made sure everyone got home safely. The concept of sending inadequate resources to a rescue operation was completely foreign to human thinking. As the human fleet changed course toward Kepler 442b, the Volani continued broadcasting their distress signal and anxiously watching the approaching asteroid field. Dr. Yuna checked their evacuation protocols and confirmed that their people could survive in specialized environmental suits for short periods, but extended exposure to higher gravity and thicker atmospheres would be fatal. The Volani had prepared emergency shelters that could protect some of their population from the asteroid impacts, but they knew that most of their people would not survive. Dr. Minho calculated that they had enough shelter space for perhaps 50,000 individuals, while the remaining 800,000 would face certain death. Neither species realized that their different approaches to emergency response were about to create the greatest misunderstanding in galactic history. The Volani expected a small rescue operation that might save a fraction of their population, while the humans were mobilizing the largest humanitarian effort their species had ever undertaken. The human fleet continued toward the Kepler system at maximum speed, while Captain Do-Yun coordinated with other human colonies in nearby star systems. Several additional ships changed course to join the rescue operation, including specialized medical vessels and engineering support craft. Meanwhile, the Volani watched their sensors and waited for some sign that help was coming. Dr. Yuna continued broadcasting their distress signal and hoped that someone in the galaxy would hear their plea and send assistance before the asteroids arrived and destroyed everything they had built on their peaceful research world. The stage was set for a first contact scenario that would challenge everything both species thought they knew about interstellar diplomacy and the true meaning of humanitarian response. Commander Soman stood in the central control room of the Volani Defense Station and stared at the sensor readings with complete disbelief. The approaching fleet showed energy signatures unlike anything in the Galactic Union database, and the number of vessels was beyond anything she had ever seen in her 40 years of military service. The lead ships were massive beyond comprehension, and the escort vessels surrounding them generated power readings that suggested they could destroy entire planets. The sensor array was detecting weapon systems that operated on principles completely unknown to Volani. Science and the defensive capabilities of the approaching fleet appeared to be orders of magnitude beyond anything the Galactic Union considered possible. Soman immediately contacted Dr. Yuna at the research facility and explained what the sensors were showing. The approaching fleet was not a rescue operation, but appeared to be a full-scale invasion force with enough firepower to conquer their entire star system. Dr. Yuna reviewed the sensor data and felt her crystalline body trembling with fear. The ships that were responding to their distress call were clearly military vessels from some unknown warrior species. The energy reading suggested that each of their escort ships carried more destructive power than the entire Volani defense fleet. The two Volani leaders quickly composed an emergency message to the nearest Galactic Union worlds and began broadcasting on all available frequencies. They reported that an unknown species with overwhelming military superiority was approaching their system in response to their distress call and appeared to be preparing for planetary conquest. Meanwhile, aboard the human flagship, Admiral Kyung was reviewing evacuation procedures with his senior staff. The massive hangar bays of the colony ships were being converted into temporary housing areas for the alien refugees, and medical teams were preparing treatment facilities for what they assumed would be standard humanoid physiology. Chief Engineer Hana was coordinating with the other ships in the fleet to ensure that they could provide adequate life support for nearly 1 million alien civilians. Dr. Taewoo had researched what little information the human database contained about crystalline-based life forms, and was preparing specialized medical equipment that could treat injuries to beings with mineral-based biology. Captain Do-Hyun was planning the shuttle operations that would transport the aliens from their dying world to the safety of the human ships. He calculated that they could complete the evacuation in approximately 6 hours if they deployed every available transport craft and maintained continuous operations. None of the humans realized that their rescue fleet appeared to be an invasion armada to the aliens, who were desperately calling for help. The cultural differences between the species were creating a misunderstanding that would have profound consequences for first contact between their civilizations. The Volani Defense Station continued broadcasting warnings to other Galactic Union worlds and describing the approaching fleet in terms that suggested an imminent military conquest. Commander Soman reported that the unknown vessels were maintaining attack formation and approaching at speeds that indicated hostile intent. Other alien species in nearby star systems began receiving the Volani warnings and mobilized their own defense fleets to respond to what appeared to be an aggressive expansion by an unknown warrior race. The messages described energy weapons that could vaporize asteroids and defensive systems that made the approaching ships essentially invulnerable to conventional attacks. Dr. Yuna attempted to compose a diplomatic message to the approaching fleet and struggled with how to address what she assumed were conquering warlords. The Volani were a peaceful species that had never engaged in interstellar warfare, and their diplomatic protocols emphasized submission and tribute when facing superior military force. The message that Dr. Yuna finally transmitted was filled with formal language that acknowledged the obvious military superiority of the approaching fleet and humbly requested mercy for the civilian population. She offered to surrender all Volani territory and resources in exchange for the lives of her people. When the human communication officers received this message, they were completely puzzled by the formal diplomatic language and the references to surrender and tribute. The universal translator was struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in human emergency response protocols. Captain Do-hyun read the alien message several times and discussed it with his senior staff. The aliens seemed to be expressing gratitude for the rescue operation, but were using language that suggested they expected to be conquered rather than saved. Admiral Kyung interpreted the message as extreme politeness from a species that was overwhelmed by the size of the human response. He decided to reply with reassurances that the evacuation would proceed smoothly and that all alien civilians would be treated with care and respect. The human response message emphasized their commitment to saving every alien life and their intention to provide whatever assistance was needed for as long as necessary. The message concluded by requesting detailed information about alien physiological requirements so that human medical teams could provide appropriate care. When Dr. Yuna received this response, she was terrified by what she interpreted as a demand for detailed information about Volani biology. The message seemed to be asking for intelligence about their species' weaknesses and medical vulnerabilities, which confirmed her worst fears about the intentions of the approaching fleet. Commander Somin interpreted the human message as a typical conquest demand from a warrior species that wanted to understand their new subjects. The references to providing care and assistance were clearly euphemisms for occupation and control. The misunderstanding continued to escalate as both species tried to communicate using completely different cultural frameworks. The humans were planning a massive humanitarian rescue operation, while the Volani were preparing for military conquest and occupation. Additional human ships continued to arrive in the system as word of the rescue operation spread throughout the human colonies. Captain Do-hyun was pleased to see specialized medical vessels and engineering support craft joining their fleet because it would allow them to provide even better care for the alien refugees. The Volani sensors detected each new arrival and interpreted the growing fleet as confirmation that they were facing a full-scale invasion. The warrior species was clearly mobilizing additional forces to ensure complete victory and the systematic conquest of Volani territory. Dr. Yuna began preparing ceremonial surrender protocols that would hopefully satisfy the conquering warriors and demonstrate that the Volani people were willing to submit peacefully. She selected their most precious cultural artifacts to offer as tribute and began composing formal statements of surrender that acknowledged the superior military power of the approaching fleet. Neither species realized that they were creating the foundation for the greatest misunderstanding in galactic history. The humans were motivated by their deepest cultural values about helping others in need, while the Volani were responding according to their traditional protocols for facing overwhelming military superiority. The stage was set for a first contact encounter that would challenge every assumption both species had about interstellar relations and the true meaning of strength and compassion in the galaxy. Lieutenant Jinwoo guided his shuttle toward the Volani research station and reviewed the evacuation procedures one final time. The human transport craft was loaded with emergency supplies and medical equipment, but his primary mission was to establish direct contact with the alien leadership and coordinate the massive rescue operation. The shuttle bay of the Volani station had been configured to receive the approaching craft, and Jinwoo could see through his view screen that the aliens had dimmed their lights and powered down their defensive systems. The universal translator was picking up formal ceremonial communications that seemed to be some kind of greeting. Protocol Dr. Yuna stood in the shuttle bay wearing her finest ceremonial robes and holding the most precious artifact in their cultural collection. The crystal formation had been shaped by Villani artists over centuries and represented their highest achievement in aesthetic and spiritual development. She had practiced the formal surrender ceremony many times and was prepared to offer tribute to the conquering warriors. When Jinwoo stepped out of his shuttle wearing standard human environmental gear, he appeared massive and intimidating to the Villani who were watching. The protective suit made him look like an armored warrior from some death world, and his casual confidence suggested that he was accustomed to dangerous situations. The young pilot looked around the shuttle bay and smiled when he saw the welcoming committee of aliens waiting for him. He activated his universal translator and prepared to deliver the standard human emergency response greeting that emphasized cooperation and mutual assistance. Jinwoo walked forward with his typical human friendliness and said, "Hey there. We are here to help with your evacuation. Everything is going to be okay, and we will make sure everyone gets to safety." The universal translator processed his words and transmitted them to the Villani communication systems, but the cultural context was completely lost in translation. What the aliens heard was something much more threatening that sounded like a declaration of dominion over their evacuation and a statement claiming control over their safety. Dr. Yuna approached the massive figure in armor and formally presented the precious crystal artifact while reciting the traditional words of surrender and tribute. She explained that her people acknowledged the superior power of his species and humbly requested mercy for their civilian population. Jinwoo was delighted when the alien scientist offered him what appeared to be a beautiful, welcoming gift. The crystal formation was unlike anything he had ever seen and clearly represented sophisticated artistic achievement. He accepted the gift with enthusiasm and immediately reached into his supply pack to offer something in return. The human emergency rations that Jinwoo offered were standard military field supplies designed to provide complete nutrition in hostile environments. The packaging was durable and functional but hardly seemed like an appropriate diplomatic gift between species. Dr. Yuna accepted the strange package with confusion and growing fear. The conquistadors were offering her some kind of military provisions which seemed to confirm that they were planning a long occupation. She carefully examined the package and noted that it contained compressed food designed for warriors engaged in extended campaigns. Jinwoo continued his friendly introduction by explaining the human evacuation plan and describing how they would transport all the alien civilians to safety aboard the colony ships. He used simple language and tried to convey reassurance about the rescue operation. The universal translator struggled with human emergency response terminology and conveyed his words as military planning language that described troop movements and population transfers. Dr. Yuna heard detailed descriptions of how the aliens would be loaded onto transport vessels and moved to locations determined by the conquering force. Commander Somin monitored the first contact meeting from the control room and watched with growing alarm as the massive armored warrior explained his species' plans for the Villani population. The detailed logistics that he described sounded like the systematic deportation of their entire civilization. Meanwhile, other human shuttles were approaching different sections of the research facility and beginning preliminary evacuations of Villani civilians who needed immediate medical attention. The human medical teams were treating alien patients with careful professionalism, but their advanced equipment and confident methods appeared threatening to the Villani who had never encountered such sophisticated military medicine. Dr. Taewoo was particularly puzzled by the extreme fragility of the alien patients and the specialized environmental requirements that their physiology demanded. The Villani seemed to be adapted for conditions that would be immediately fatal to most known species, and their bodies appeared to be constructed from mineral compounds rather than organic tissues. The human medical officer began taking detailed scans and biological samples to better understand how to treat the alien patients, but his scientific procedures looked like intelligence-gathering operations to the Villani, who were convinced that the conquering species was studying their biology to identify weaknesses Jin Woo completed his initial meeting with Dr. Yuna and prepared to return to the human flagship with his preliminary report about alien evacuation requirements. He thanked the scientist for her cooperation and assured her that human medical teams would provide excellent care. For all Villani civilians, Dr. Yuna watched the massive warrior return to his assault shuttle and felt completely overwhelmed by the situation. The conquering species appeared to be incredibly advanced, and their preliminary operations suggested that they had extensive experience with planetary occupation and population management. The first contact meeting had confirmed all of her worst fears about the approaching fleet. The warriors were clearly planning to systematically remove the entire Villani population from their homeworld and transport them to locations where they could be controlled and managed. Commander Soman began updating her emergency reports to other Galactic Union worlds and described the first contact encounter in terms that emphasized the military efficiency and advanced capabilities of the unknown species. She reported that their warriors appeared to be highly trained professionals who were experienced in planetary conquest operations. Neither the humans nor the Villani realized that their cultural differences were creating a cascade of misunderstandings that would define their relationship for years to come. The human commitment to comprehensive humanitarian assistance was being interpreted as overwhelming military domination, while Villani diplomatic protocols were being seen as excessive politeness. The rescue operation continued according to human emergency response procedures, while the aliens prepared for what they believed would be systematic conquest and occupation. The greatest humanitarian effort in galactic history was being perceived as the most efficient military invasion that any species had ever witnessed. Captain Doyun received Jin Woo's preliminary report and was pleased that first contact had proceeded smoothly. The alien leadership appeared to be cooperative and grateful for human assistance, which would make the evacuation operation much more efficient than originally planned. War Commander Vex of the Kreth Dominion studied the sensor readings from the Kepler system and felt his predatory instincts stirring. The massive fleet that had assembled around the primitive Villani world represented a direct challenge to Kreth territorial expansion and could not be allowed to succeed. The Kreth were an aggressive species that had built their empire by conquering weaker civilizations and enslaving their populations. They had been monitoring the Villani research colony for months and were planning to claim the system as soon as the asteroid impact eliminated the current inhabitants. Vex commanded a powerful war fleet of 12 heavy cruisers that represented the cutting edge of Kreth military technology. Each ship carried enough firepower to reduce a planetary surface to molten slag, and their weapon systems had been tested in dozens of successful conquest operations. The unknown species that had responded to the Villani distress call appeared to be competitors for the same territory, and their fleet composition suggested that they were also interested in claiming the Kepler system for themselves. Vex could not allow potential rivals to establish a foothold in what the Kreth considered their expansion. Zone the war commander activated his fleet communication system and addressed his subordinates with the traditional Kreth battle declaration. He explained that they would demonstrate superior Kreth military power by destroying the rival fleet and claiming their rightful prize of conquered territory. The 12 Kreth warships jumped into the Kepler system in standard attack formation and immediately began targeting the largest vessels in the human fleet. Their weapons systems locked onto what appeared to be the command ships and prepared to deliver devastating opening salvos that would cripple the enemy. Fleet Captain Do-Yun was coordinating shuttle schedules with his logistics officers when Commander Yoonji burst onto the bridge. With an urgent tactical report, the Villani sensor arrays had detected multiple ships jumping into the system, and their energy signatures indicated military vessels with active weapons systems. The human captain stared at the tactical display with complete confusion as he watched 12 unknown ships taking aggressive positions around the evacuation fleet. Commander Yoonji reported that the new arrivals were powering up weapons and appeared to be preparing for combat operations. Do-Hyun could not understand why anyone would attack a humanitarian rescue mission. The concept of interfering with emergency evacuation procedures was so foreign to human thinking that he initially assumed there must be some kind of communication error. First, Kreth weapons barrage struck the human colony ship Sejong and produced spectacular energy discharges that lit up the entire hull. Commander Unji reported that the enemy weapons were using plasma-based technology, but the damage to human systems appeared to be minimal. Captain Doyun felt growing irritation as he realized that hostile aliens were actually shooting at rescue ships. The attack was not only morally outrageous, but was also interfering with time-critical evacuation operations that could determine whether innocent civilians lived or died. Admiral Kyung received damage reports from all the ships in the evacuation fleet and confirmed that the enemy weapons were having virtually no effect on human defensive systems. The hostile aliens appeared to be using technology that was decades behind human military capabilities. The Kreth war commander was shocked when his opening barrage failed to destroy any of the enemy vessels. The rival species appeared to have defensive capabilities that could absorb massive energy discharges without sustaining significant damage. Vex ordered his fleet to increase power to maximum levels and concentrate all firepower on the largest enemy vessel. The 12 Kreth warships began, pouring continuous energy streams into the human flagship, while maintaining attack positions around the evacuation fleet. Dr. Yuna watched the battle from the Villani research station and could not believe what she was seeing. The unknown warrior species was completely ignoring the Kreth attack and continuing their evacuation operations as if nothing was happening. Their massive ships were absorbing energy weapons that should have vaporized them instantly. Dr. Minho monitored the human communication channels and discovered that the warriors were treating the Kreth fleet as a minor inconvenience that was interfering with their rescue schedule. The casual dismissal of what the Galactic Union considered a powerful military force was beyond anything the Villani had thought possible. Admiral Kyung was becoming increasingly annoyed by the persistent weapons fire that was disrupting evacuation procedures. He activated the fleet communication system and made an announcement to all ships in the rescue operation. The admiral explained that hostile contacts were interfering with emergency operations and ordered the escort vessels to remove the obstacles so that evacuation procedures could continue without further interruption. He emphasized that the safety of alien civilians was their primary concern, and that nothing should be allowed to delay the rescue mission. Commander Yunji received authorization to engage the hostile fleet and began coordinating with the other human destroyer captains. The escort vessels had been designed to protect colony ships from pirates and hostile aliens, but had never been tested against a fleet-sized enemy force. The 5 human destroyers that responded to Admiral Kyung's order were considered lightly armed escort vessels by human military standards. Their primary mission was defensive, and their weapon systems had been designed for minimum necessary force rather than overwhelming destruction. Captain Soo-young commanded the lead destroyer and carefully analyzed the tactical situation before engaging the enemy fleet. She noted that the hostile aliens were using relatively primitive energy weapons, and their defensive capabilities appeared to be minimal. The human destroyer opened fire, with what Captain Soo-young considered a measured response designed to disable, rather than destroy the enemy vessels. Her weapon systems were calibrated for minimum force that would neutralize threats without causing unnecessary casualties. Kreth flagship exploded in a brilliant flash of superheated plasma as the human weapons tore through its hull and ignited its power systems. War Commander Vex had just enough time to realize that his species had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Before his ship was vaporized, the remaining Kreth vessels attempted to retreat, but discovered that human weapons had superior range and accuracy. The escort destroyers systematically disabled each enemy ship with precise targeting that left the crews alive but rendered their vessels completely helpless. Dr. Yuna watched in amazement as the 5 human escort ships destroyed what the Galactic Union would have considered an overwhelming military force in less than 17 minutes. The warriors had used what they clearly considered minimum force while achieving complete tactical victory. The Villani scientist finally began to understand that the massive fleet surrounding their world was not an invasion armada, but rather the most powerful humanitarian rescue force in galactic history. The warriors who had come to save them possessed military capabilities that redefined what civilized species thought was possible. Dr. Yuna stood in the observation dome of the research facility and watched human shuttles moving in perfect coordination between the evacuation fleet and the Villani civilian shelters. The systematic efficiency of the rescue operation was unlike anything she had ever witnessed in galactic humanitarian efforts. Medical technician Jisoo carefully adjusted the environmental controls in her shuttle to accommodate the fragile physiology of a young Vellani patient. The child had been injured during the emergency evacuation procedures and needed specialized treatment that could only be provided aboard the human medical vessels. The human medic had spent hours studying Vellani biology and learning how to treat injuries to crystalline-based life. Forms her gentle care and professional competence demonstrated the same dedication that human medical personnel showed to their own species. Engineer Ming Yu was working around the clock to modify human life support systems so they could accommodate the environmental requirements of nearly 1 million Vellani refugees. The massive colony ships were being converted into temporary homes that could sustain the alien population for months if necessary. Pilot Siwoo had made 14 trips through the dangerous asteroid field to evacuate Vellani civilians from remote research stations. The young human officer was risking his life repeatedly to ensure that not a single alien would be left behind when the asteroids finally struck their world. Dr. Yuna began to understand that the humans were not conquering warriors, but rather members of a species that responded to distress calls with overwhelming humanitarian commitment. The massive military fleet that had terrified the Galactic Union was actually a rescue armada dedicated entirely to saving alien lives. The Vellani scientist activated her personal communication device and began composing a message that would be broadcast throughout the galaxy. The truth about the human species needed to be shared with every civilization that had received the earlier warnings about aggressive conquest. Her message began by acknowledging the original mistake in interpreting human intentions and explained how cultural differences had created the misunderstanding. She described the systematic evacuation operation and emphasized the extraordinary commitment that humans were demonstrating to alien welfare. Dr. Yuna reported that the human fleet had enough firepower to conquer entire star systems but was using their overwhelming capabilities exclusively for humanitarian purposes. The warriors who had destroyed a Kreeth war fleet in 17 minutes were treating alien civilians with gentleness and respect that exceeded anything. In Galactic Union protocols, the message concluded with a statement that would reshape galactic diplomacy for generations. Dr. Yuna transmitted that when humans received a distress call, they did not send help, but rather became help by mobilizing their entire civilization to ensure that everyone survived. Commander Somin monitored the final stages of the evacuation operation and confirmed that all 847,000 Vellani civilians had been successfully transferred to human ships. The rescue had been completed in exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes according to the original human timeline. Admiral Kyung reviewed the casualty reports and was pleased that the evacuation had proceeded without losing a single alien life. The human medical teams had treated over 3,000 injured Vellani and had established long-term care facilities for those who needed extended treatment. Captain Do-hyun coordinated with the other colony ships to ensure that the Vellani refugees would be comfortable during their journey to temporary homes in human space. The alien population would be provided with everything they needed to rebuild their civilization on worlds that matched their environmental requirements. Dr. Tae-woo had learned more about crystalline-based biology in 6 days than the Galactic Union had discovered in decades of research. The human medical database now contained comprehensive treatment protocols for Vellani physiology that could be shared with other species. The human fleet prepared to depart the Kepler system after confirming that all Vellani civilians were safely aboard and that the asteroid impact would completely destroy their former homeworld. The rescue operation had been a complete success according to human standards. Dr. Yuna stood on the observation deck of the colony ship that had become her temporary home and watched through the viewport as the asteroids finally struck Kepler 442b. The world where her people had lived and worked for generations was reduced to molten rock and metal in a matter of hours. She realized that without human intervention, every member of her species would have died in that catastrophic impact. The warriors who had initially terrified her had mobilized the largest rescue fleet in galactic history and had refused to leave anyone behind. The Vellani scientist began working with human researchers to document the cultural misunderstanding that had nearly prevented successful first contact. Her analysis would become required reading for diplomatic personnel throughout the galaxy. Meanwhile, the Kreth Dominion quietly abandoned their expansion plans after analyzing the battle reports from their destroyed war fleet. The species, that could vaporize 12 warships while conducting a civilian evacuation, clearly possessed military capabilities that made resistance impossible. Other aggressive civilizations throughout the galaxy received similar messages and reconsidered their territorial ambitions. The human demonstration of overwhelming force in defense of complete strangers suggested that actual threats to human interests would face proportionally more decisive responses. 6 months later, Dr. Yuna participated in the formal establishment of the Villani colony worlds that humans had prepared for her people. The new settlements were designed to match the environmental conditions of their original homeworld, but included improved defensive systems and emergency protocols. The Galactic Union completely revised their understanding of both humanitarian response and military capability after studying the human rescue operation. Previous assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and aggressive expansion were proven completely wrong. Dr. Yuna became the official Villani ambassador to human space and worked to establish cultural exchange programs that would prevent similar misunderstandings in future first contact scenarios. Her reports emphasized that humans represented a completely new model of civilization that combined overwhelming military power with absolute dedication to protecting innocent life. The story of the Kepler rescue operation spread throughout the galaxy and established humans as the species that other civilizations contacted when they faced emergencies that exceeded their own capabilities. The human response to alien distress calls became the new standard for humanitarian intervention. Years later, when other species asked Dr. Yuna to describe human civilization, she would explain that they were the people who heard a call for help and brought enough force to conquer a star system, but used it only to ensure that not a single innocent being was left behind. The galaxy learned that when dealing with humans, the most important thing to understand was that their greatest strength was not their advanced technology or overwhelming military power, but rather their absolute refusal to abandon anyone who needed help regardless of species or political affiliation. This lesson would reshape interstellar relations and establish new protocols for emergency response that emphasized the human model of becoming the help that others needed rather than simply sending assistance and hoping for the best.